The hosts asked me to look at the past, present, and future of U.S. maritime strategy, all in 15 minutes, so let's start with the basics. What is maritime strategy? I define strategy as the art and science of using force to accomplish goals, and maritime strategy as the art and science of using sea power to accomplish goals related to the sea. So what is sea power? Two things. It is the virtuous cycle of trade, policy, and military power that makes seafaring societies rich and powerful, and it is the application of maritime strategy to geopolitical advantage. We forge the tools through the cycle, and then political and military leaders use the tools for the purposes they and the wider public deem beneficial. How sea power actually works. First, the virtuous cycle. Mahanian laid out the classic definition of sea power, defining it as a chain linking domestic industrial production with merchant shipping and naval forces, and with commercial, diplomatic, and military access to ports or naval bases in key trading areas. Trade, ships, and bases are the acronyms for sea power. Trade was king for Mahanian. All three links in the chain of sea power, domestic, maritime, and foreign, must be solid for maritime enterprise to thrive. Without production, you have nothing to sell abroad, so you don't need a merchant fleet or a navy to protect it. Without merchant ships and warships, you depend on someone else to keep the goods you produce for sale to foreign customers. Dependence entrusts national well-being to the whims of others. And without access to foreign ports, it doesn't matter what you make at home, or what you can transport by sea, no one will consume your wares, and you won't profit from sea trade. Now, at the risk of invoking Mahanian's ghost, I have modified his formula to make a clearer distinction between military sea power and merchant sea power and, hopefully, to explain how the virtuous cycle of trade, shipping, and bases works. He conflated the two, and thereby obscured how the cycle works. I define sea power as twin, parallel supply chains. The first is the familiar commercial supply chain that links domestic manufacturers with merchant fleets to carry domestically produced goods across the seaborne transport network to overseas ports to be unloaded and sold, so that buyers can satisfy their wants and needs. The second is the naval supply chain that links domestic naval shipbuilding with armed fleets to guard trade, with foreign ports or naval bases to maintain commercial and diplomatic access while logistically supporting fleet operations. So commercial supply chains enrich the people who live on the sea. Governments take tax revenues from commercial transactions, and some of that revenue goes to navies to protect commercial supply chains. In turn, commerce funds its own guards through naval supply chains, which in turn ensure the free flow of commerce. And so the virtuous cycle goes into the indefinite future, provided political and military leaders remember their duty to act as implementers of the nation's maritime policies. What do we do with sea power as a tool? Maritime strategy uses sea power for a variety of purposes, utilizing the familiar logic of ends, ways, and means. Looking through the diplomatic and military history of the United States, four things stand out in maritime strategy. First, the Monroe Doctrine placed America beyond the reach of European empires as future zones of conquest or proxy powers. We rarely mention Monroe by name, but the possessive impulse is there. Witness the recent talk of Greenland and the Panama Canal. Second, the open door seeks to keep the East Asian periphery, especially China, open to American trade interests, while maintaining commercial access. Third, geopolitical rebalancing in Western Europe and East Asia aims to prevent any aggressor from uniting one or both regions under its control, and thereby posing a threat to the United States across the ocean. This is the Western Hemisphere's first line of defense. And fourth, and closely related to the previous point, containment seeks to prevent an aggressor from expanding its influence beyond Eurasia to the detriment of U.S. interests and objectives. All of these are uses of sea power as an implementation of geostrategy. They remain recurring themes, even if the language for expressing them changes. Mahanian, and, post-Mahanian, maritime strategy. Which brings us to contemporary U.S. maritime strategy. I would propose 4 metrics for evaluating maritime strategy. First, how Mahanian, or post-Mahanian, is the strategy? In other words, how adversarial is it? In a casual sense, Mahanian naval forces take a no-nonsense approach to the profession of arms at sea, preparing to confront a peer challenger. Post-Mahanian naval forces, by contrast, tend to assume that peer challengers are in short supply, if at all, and thus coercing an outmatched state adversary while suppressing sub-state lawbreakers is the purpose of a navy's existence. Professor Jeff Till of King's College London coined the term Mahanian, post-Mahanian in the journal Orbis around 2007, arguing that Western and Asian powers were on opposing cultural trajectories, and that there were serious consequences to this mismatch. Jeff also hinted at an important question. Namely, do you need to have an enemy to have a strategy? I would say yes. The enemy provides an indispensable benchmark for the adequacy of your strategy, operational design, and fleet design. Think about it. Mahanian articulated a formula for determining the size and configuration of a fleet or fleet detachment. He stated that you need a fleet sufficient to go to sea and fight, with reasonable prospects of success, the largest force likely to be encountered at the battle site and time. Force, space, time, as the operational artist would say. But how do you run that calculation unless you identify the most likely opponent? You can't. There is no substitute for naming the opponent, measuring his strength, and estimating what fraction of his strength the enemy's leadership will commit to action at the battle site and time, and how long he will keep his fighting forces on the scene to enforce his will. As Captain Harry Yarnell put it in 1919, when the U.S. Navy was surveying the post-World War I seascape to predict the next big thing in naval warfare, designing a force without thinking about the enemy is like forging a machine tool without knowing whether you're making a hairpin or a locomotive. The enemy provides the focus. Or, as the Roman philosopher Seneca wrote, there's no fair wind if you don't know which port you're heading for. Without knowing what it's preparing for, the Navy drifts aimlessly, uncertain whether its forces and methods are appropriate to the time and circumstances. In short, the post-Mahanian force inhabits a different intellectual universe than the Mahanian one. It lacks that focus. Both are guided by conflicting assumptions about the saltwater arena. Let's start with the mirror. End of history thinking swept over the country, and the Navy, in the midst of the Cold War's triumphant outcome. In 1992, a directive called, From the Sea, the Navy's first attempt at a post-Cold War strategy, essentially declared that there was no such thing as a peer enemy. The United States and its allies controlled the seas, no one could challenge them, and so they could more or less set aside their first and most important function, preparing to fight for control of the seas. That declaration gave American naval operations a post-Mahanian flavor for more than a decade. Contrast that with the mindset in China. China committed itself to building a formidable navy in the mid-1990s, around the time the United States withdrew. In 2004, a State Council Defense White Paper announced that China intended to bid to control the sea and airspace of an expanding offshore belt. The 2004 White Paper was very Mahanian in tone. China wanted control of maritime space, by force of arms if necessary. Beijing's subsequent statements of intent only reinforced that war-minded outlook. The bottom line, the U.S. Navy left the Mahanian world of naval warfare at almost the exact historical moment that China entered it. Professor Till would remind us that it is very difficult for a post-Mahanian navy accustomed to policing to reinvent itself for the Mahanian era. This is true in a material sense. Why are we celebrating the successful development of the maritime strike Tomahawk now, at the waning moment of our rivalry with China, when we had one in our arsenal 30 years ago and chose to discard it? Imagine what we would have now if we had kept it and perfected it. But this is even more true in human terms. It is difficult to re-establish the habit of fighting in thought, feeling, and action once it has ceased to develop, especially if senior leaders decide that it will cease to develop. Fortunately, we have been moving slowly toward a Mahanian world, albeit with some changes, since about 2012, with the rise of Xi Jinping. I call that transition period America's Voldemort moment. Everyone knew that a new antagonist was rising in the Western Pacific, but refused to name it for fear of dire consequences. Our reluctance held us back. How do you convey a sense of urgency to the American service, lawmakers, and taxpayers if you refuse to explain why that urgency matters? Fortunately, we have emerged from that transition phase. Since about 2015, With the updated and more aggressive cooperative strategy for 21st century sea power, Voldemort's name has been uttered out loud. But it was too late. Beijing began calling us its next potential adversary 3 decades ago, and preparing accordingly while we did other things. That suggests China retains the upper hand in imagination and the spirit of competing at sea. Beijing has long claimed the main role, while we have tried to reclaim it. You neglect your primary function at your peril. The Navy cannot fight the next naval war alone. Second, how integrated is the U.S. maritime strategy? This is an era of joint sea power, when the Army, Air Force, and cyber forces are as sure an implementer of maritime strategy as the Navy and Marines. The reason is simple: the stronger force assembled at the time and place of battle wins, not necessarily the stronger Navy. China understands that. America seems to have caught on late. At the recent Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, Secretary Hegseth announced that we are positioning joint forces to defend the first and second island chains. Doing so would deny those islands, which are allied territory, to China. Forces on and around the islands for territorial defense could also close the straits between the islands, denying the PLA and Chinese merchant fleet access to the vast maneuvering space that is the Western Pacific. Joint sea power could inflict military and economic losses on China. As a result, our land-based services have embraced, or re-embraced, their heritage as sea services. Under the heading, Force Design 2030, the U.S. Marine Corps is reinventing itself, in part, as an island defense force to help our fleet deny and gain control of geographic space. In a similar vein, the Army is pursuing multi-domain operations in the Asian island chains. And I would be remiss not to mention the Air Force, which has pursued capabilities like quick-strike precision minefields and quick-sink munitions for anti-ship missions. Meanwhile, the Space Force maintains a sleepless watch, helping us detect, track, and target red teams. It is inspiring to watch the joint force reinvent itself as an implementer of maritime strategy. Someone needs to be in charge of the strategy. Third, how maritime is the strategy? Does it encompass all government agencies involved in the maritime effort, plus private sector actors? None of us do. America has never had a true maritime strategy. Again, Mahanian viewed sea power as an all-encompassing national effort, and no one person is in charge of it all. Authority is spread among agencies like the Navy, State, Homeland Security, and Transportation. And much of the effort is outside the direct control of the government, especially the defense industrial complex. I have argued that the National Security Council should be the center of U.S. maritime strategy, simply because the White House has authority over government stakeholders in the maritime effort. It can direct their efforts. It is also the logical actor to oversee relations with private actors in the maritime arena. Congress seems to agree, judging by the Ships for America Act, now being considered in the House and Senate. Given the fragmented nature of America's current maritime strategy, I see little alternative to centralizing power over it. Someone must manage the Mahanian cycle between trade, diplomacy, and military power, lest maritime statecraft become adrift. Reliable allies aid American sea power. Fourth, and finally, how multinational is a strategy? To some degree, all U.S. maritime strategies have been multinational since World War II. We have always fought alongside our allies. But some have been more unilateral than others. Because the United States was the dominant ally in the hegemonic alliance during the Cold War, it tended to set the agenda, and allies tended to follow it. The Navy broke with that pattern, in part, with its 2007 and 2015 Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power, which envisioned a consortium of shipping to police the seas. In theory, our navies form an alliance of equals, a 1,000-ship navy, as Admiral Mike Mullen called it. If the United States expects allies, partners, and friends to contribute the bulk of its multinational fleet, then it must be more subservient to their wishes. The United States must be more multilateral. The nature of the competitive environment, power realities, and alliance dynamics help determine how multinational and unilateral U.S. maritime strategy will be. American naval strategy is constantly changing. Here are 4 axes for classifying maritime strategy. adversarial or not joint, maritime, and multinational. Looking back, American maritime strategy has tended to oscillate between Mahanian and post-Mahanian phases as the world around us has changed. The danger is that we become inert as the post-Mahanian world witnesses the emergence of Mahanian challengers. After all, it is easier to reconfigure a force built for high-end warfare to police sub-state lawbreakers, in a relatively less threatening environment, than a police force that must prepare for a peer competitor on the oceanic battlefield. I think we can see 5 distinct generations of U.S. maritime strategy since 1945. First, although not codified, early Cold War strategy was a curious hybrid of Mahanian and post-Mahanian strategy. On the one hand, we competed strategically against a designated enemy, the Soviet Union. That was the Mahanian element. But on the other hand, the Soviet Navy did not emerge as a serious rival until the 1970s. That quiet interlude lulled our Navy into thinking about the sea in post-Mahanian terms, as a safe haven from which our ocean-going fleets could project power into theaters like Korea and Vietnam. After that strategic vacation, naval leaders were stunned in the 1970s when the Soviet Navy seemed to explode as a comparable fighting force. And early Cold War maritime strategy was not particularly joint or maritime in tone. As far as alliance politics were concerned, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps more or less set the agenda, and others followed suit. Second, the John Lehman, James Watkins, maritime strategy of the 1980s had a very Mahanian outlook. Having surrendered our combat superiority during the early Cold War, when command of the sea seemed a birthright, we had to regain it in the late Cold War, when we realized that we would once again have to fight for command of the sea before we could use the sea to project power. The strategy declared that we would pursue the Soviet Union around its coastlines, stretching and thinning Soviet resources and thereby reducing pressure along the inter-German frontier, which was assumed to be the main battleground. You will get some pushback from the strategists of that, but I would argue that the Lehman-Watkins strategy was not particularly joint or maritime in outlook, while it was multinational in the sense that the United States led a hegemonic alliance in which our leadership had a dominant voice. Third, the from the sea strategy, which I mentioned earlier, stated that the Navy and Marine Corps would transform themselves into fundamentally different naval forces, with little need to prepare for intense sea combat. The Navy was teetering from a Mahanian world to a post-Mahanian one thanks to a mandate from naval leaders. Another strategic vacation was in sight. In a sense, the 1990s marked a return to the approach of the 1950s and 1960s, with the Navy pursuing a strategy that saw no enemies and was not particularly joint, maritime, or multinational. We were content with what we had achieved. Fourth, the cooperative strategy era, which lasted from about 2005 to 2015, saw a vigorous post-Mahanian strategy, although the strategy documents of 2007 and 2015 had some Mahanian flair. It is worth noting that the word China does not appear once in the 2007 edition. These strategies were not particularly joint, or maritime as I have defined them, but they were very multinational in outlook, based on multilateral guardianship of the liberal trade system and seaborne commerce. This did not last. After the Voldemort transition phase, the refreshed strategy of 2015 marked a competitive shift. Naval leaders now recognized that while cooperation was desirable, great power rivals had to be outmaneuvered, and perhaps defeated. And fifth, the superiority at sea strategy, which the Navy has used since 2020, the Biden administration has not disavowed it or replaced it with another, marks a return to Mahan's world. It names names, stating directly that strategic competition is taking place at the naval level. Superiority at sea kowtows to joint sea power, mentioning the U.S. Air Force, Army, and Space Force on several occasions. But the joint dimension is not at the forefront of the strategy. Likewise, the document raises the importance of trade from time to time, which gives it a maritime twist. But in my judgment, the directive does not fully reflect the Mahanian centrality of trade and commerce, or the non-military elements of sea power. But the strategy is very multinational in its character. It makes clear, repeatedly, that allies, partners, and friends are essential to America's success on the high seas. So what are the trends? We are trending toward China as a Mahanian competitor. We are increasingly unified in our maritime operations. Our leadership is trending toward a truly maritime-first strategy, and we are recognizing our dependence on allies, partners, and friends in the region. All good. Our thinking is right. Now we just have to execute. And fast.